Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he stand by all of his government's statements and actions?
Yes, and in particular I stand by this government's action to conclude negotiations on a trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which will deliver duty-free access for 99% of New Zealand's exports over 10 years. Growing trade relationships across the world is a key part of our plan to grow the economy, to lift incomes and to create jobs for Kiwis. Can I just acknowledge the fantastic work of Trade Minister Todd McClay in getting this deal over the line and setting our exporters up for more success so that we can grow our economy and earn the money that we need to invest in the world-class health and education that Kiwis deserve.
Supplementary question. Does he stand by his statements, we've got very good processes for managing conflict of interest, and that ministers need to understand and internalise the responsibility that they have? If so, is he confident that all of his ministers are managing their conflicts of interest appropriately?
Yes, I'm confident real or perceived conflicts were managed, declared and are being managed appropriately.
Can he confirm if any conflicts of interest were declared and managed by any cabinet ministers regarding their association with the tobacco industry when the government made changes to New Zealand's smoke-free laws and the taxation of tobacco products?
What I can confirm is that any real or perceived conflicts are raised. We've assiduously followed Cabinet Office advice from day one of this government, and we take that very seriously.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Honourable Chris Hipkins.
I asked the Prime Minister whether any conflicts of interest were declared and managed regarding a specific issue that Cabinet has considered, and he did not address that question.
The Prime Minister might like to consider his answer.
As per the previous government, the policy of the Cabinet Office is not to publish conflicts, as per the previous, has been the policy for successive governments.
Supplementary question. Did any ministers leave the room when the Smoke-Free Environments and Regulated Products Amendment Bill or the $216 million tax break for heated tobacco products were discussed by Cabinet?
Again, Cabinet conflicts, perceived or real, are managed appropriately and assiduously through the Cabinet Office guidelines. We have taken that very seriously. We operate very differently from the previous administration. We don't need 16 reminders from the Cabinet Office to manage conflicts.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Honourable Chris Hipkins.
If the Cabinet does indeed take their responsibilities very seriously, then the Prime Minister should have no difficulty answering the question.
That's true. There will always be aspects of Cabinet government that aren't in the public arena at the time that the question might be asked. Prime Minister has answered, I think, quite reasonably, given the nature of the question.
Who provided the advice to government that nicotine is as harmful as tobacco, coffee?
Sorry, can you ask the question again?
Who provided advice to the government that the nicotine is as harmful as caffeine?
That would be a question that would be best directed to the Associate Minister of Health.
Supplementary question. Who provided, quote, independent, end quote, advice to Casey Costello justifying the $216 million tax break on heated tobacco products his government agreed to?
Well, I'd say to that member, what we are doing is this country has had tremendous success at lowering daily smoking rates. We're down at 6.8%, heading to 5% to deliver on smoke-free 2025. We are now in a place where we actually have really hard, stubborn smokers that we're trying to get off cigarettes into alternatives. We're prepared on this side to try something different. When he represents the $216 million, I think, as a tax break, it's not a tax break. What it is a difference of moving from cigarettes into an alternative product at a lower excise duty. And we are good, prudent economic managers on this side of the House, and we're making sure that we are allowing for that in an accounting sense for the most conservative transition.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Despite the very long answer the Prime Minister gave, he didn't actually address the question of who provided the supposedly independent advice to Casey Costello justifying the decision to remove the tax on heated tobacco products.
Yes, I know, but he did say that the government doesn't consider it to be a tax break, which would kind of nullify the rest of the answer. But take another question without penalty.
Who provided independent advice to Casey Costello justifying the tax changes when it comes to heated tobacco products?
Again, ministers receive a lot of advice from a lot of different sources all of the time. They don't always take it, they do, but I just ask the member to direct the question directly to the Associate Minister of Health.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. If he doesn't know who's providing advice to the Minister, how can he be confident that conflicts of interest are being appropriately managed?
Because I know that that minister is determined to lower smoking rates across this country and is doing so incredibly passionately and is determined to do it. And I just say to that member, if he cares a lot about conflicts, I wouldn't call a sister-in-law a distant relative.
Order, Mr. Speaker.
Points of order are heard in silence. Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, last year the Prime Minister objected to the fact that he himself brought a member of his own family into the debate, and you required me to withdraw and apologise for the Prime Minister doing that. We've now got a situation where repeatedly the government have named a public servant who happens to be related to a member of the opposition in the House, a public servant who cannot speak back, a public servant who is part of a politically neutral public service, a public servant who declared their conflict of interest and has done absolutely nothing wrong. The Prime Minister should be, as you required me to, the Prime Minister should be required to withdraw and apologise for that. We had a situation in the House before the recess where the point of order process and personal explanation process was abused by the Deputy Prime Minister. I don't think you should allow the Prime Minister to continue with that.
The Prime Minister might like to consider whether he withdraws that particular remark.
Consider I named anybody.
No, but the inference.
I withdraw and apologise.
Rawiri Waititi.
Does he agree with the Minister for Children that allowing providers to use force against children may be seen as, quote, increasing the potential risk of abuse in custody, unquote, and if so, why is he allowing bootcamp providers to use force on children, especially when it perpetuates the abuse in state care detailed in the Whanaketia report?
Again, what we want to see across government, across the delivery of social services, is enhanced child safeguarding and protection. We want to see advocacy available for those young people in those facilities. But we're also acknowledging that these are some of our most serious young offenders, and if there are issues around absconding or if there are issues around harm to each other or to themselves, then restraint is appropriate, but it's got to be used under strict guidelines.